Mirey Atallah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for
Uh,
having me.
First of all, could you tell us about your organization?
Yes. So I work for the DRC's National REDD Fund, FONARED, which was established in 2013 and rendered operational in 2016. It's a fund at the national level which is intended to mobilize and implement financing to help address deforestation in the country. It's a very innovative instrument because it is, generally speaking, countries deal with REDD or forests by the Ministry of Environment. But in that case, it's a joint endeavor between the Ministry of Finance, who has the presidency of the board, and the Ministry of Environment, who is the vice president of the board. But it's a governance structure that is also open. So there are representatives of civil society, indigenous people, the private sector, and donors, as well as 6 members of government sitting on the board of that fund and deciding what are the priorities, what should be allocated where, and determining, the pathway in terms of how the country should be supported to reduce its deforestation. So within that fund, there is a secretariat that services the fund on a daily basis, and I'm the chief technical advisor for that fund.
So, to be clear, this fund is for your country specifically.
For the DRC, yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
So, what lessons can Suriname, other countries in the region, learn from your experience at this fund?
So I think first and foremost, it is essential to have a really clear strategy in terms of where you want to go, what is the country wanting to achieve, and what are the issues that need to be addressed. Because in that way, it becomes much more operational and much more clear, both for the government to be able to endorse it, and also for donors to be able to support it. One of the key lessons as well is, and that has emerged thanks to the National REDD strategy for the DRC, is that to protect the forest, you don't need to work just on the forest. Even though the case may be slightly different in Suriname, where the forest cover is much higher than the DRC and the population is much lower. But what we've discovered in DRC is that actually to protect the forest, you need to be working with agriculture. To protect the forest, you need to be working with energy. You need to be working, for example, with infrastructure. Where do you plan your roads? How do you connect different parts of the country? And all of these are issues that are not within the mandate of the Ministry of Environment. And so this brought to the fore the intersectoral dimension of reducing deforestation. And in the case of DRC, perhaps the same here. The Ministry of Environment is not necessarily a very powerful ministry. In DRC, the Ministry of Agriculture or Ministry of Mining are much more powerful because of the income they generate to the treasury, correct? And so had this issue remained to be tackled by the Ministry of Environment, it would have been very difficult to have all the other ministries on board and to have the Ministry of Mining, for example, agree to share the mining cadastre and agree that there should be, at some point, certain trade-offs that need to be made between mining and forests. Having the fund placed within the Ministry of Finance essentially gave it a lot of power. Because that is a minister or that is a ministry that is usually much more powerful than all the others put together. It's also a ministry that has this intersectoral overview of all the different sectors and is able to bring them all together. And I would say that one of the key dimensions that should not be forgotten is that the Ministry of Finance essentially is not benefiting from this fund. The Ministry of Finance allocates the funding mobilized to all the different sectors. And so it is able to take a step back and, to be a little bit more equitable in terms of what needs to be done. Whereas in certain cases, we had seen ministries of environment who are focal points for certain funds retain those funds within their own ministries, also because the environment sector is so underfunded. So I think these would be the two key lessons to convey. One is really to have a strategy that is grounded in solid investigation and has a solid vision of where the country is heading. And two is to place the coordination of the implementation of this strategy within an entity that is able to pull together all the different forces in the country.
When it comes to issues of the environment and land, climate change, a big challenge for countries in the region is the whole issue of finance. We do hear that funds are available. What are countries not doing, or what do they need to do differently in order to tap into the funding that is there for the projects that they need to undertake?
Well, I think in the conference, a lot of time the issue of trust came up. And there is, and you see that in the international negotiations, there is a lack of there is distrust between the donors and the countries. And I think a structure such as in the case of DRC, a structure such as the National REDD Fund with its governance, where the donors are sitting on the board of the fund, but they are also sitting there's a technical committee that does the pre-screening of funding proposals before they are submitted to the board. So the donors are sitting in these two. There is a constant dialogue between the country and the donor community on what to do with the funding, what are the key issues, what are the problems, and so on. And that helps alleviate the distrust. And I think that's an important point. Second is again, this whole fragmentation into small, tiny projects increases the transaction on both sides. Transaction cost for the recipient country, because you have to prepare multiple proposals and so on, but also on part of the donors. And what I've found for sure is that the investment plan, so the National REDD strategy for the DRCs goes until 2030. And then it's implemented or operationalized via 5-year investment plans. So these investment plans have actually been quite instrumental in helping mobilizing the donors, because it's allowed the country to say what is the range of issues, what is the scale of effort, and what is the scale of financing that is needed. And so rather than having a modest offer, it was an ambitious offer, both in terms of what can be delivered with the money and how much money is needed. And I think, so that brings me, this is somewhere something that we're still working on in the DRC. The ambition of the effort and of the results is important, but it's important also to match it with some level of national contribution, financial contribution. We're working on that in the DRC. It's still not the case, but relieving this impression that the donors have that this is only being done because it's donor-driven, because it's funding-driven, is important, and they essentially react very positively when the country puts in its own resources as well.
There was this $100 billion proposal that was mentioned earlier. Could you just share with us what that's all about and what's happening with that, raising that money?
Okay, so we need to go back 10 years to 2009 in Copenhagen, when the Copenhagen Agreement was being negotiated. If you recall, there were, I think, 120 heads of state that had gone to Copenhagen for that climate COP. There was a need to come out of there with an agreement of some sorts. And there is this tension that has always been very tangible in the context of the UNFCCC between what we call Annex 1 countries and non-Annex 1 countries. Essentially, Annex 1 countries are those countries that have gone through the Industrial Revolution, that have built their economies on the Industrial Revolution, and that therefore are considered as being responsible for climate change and for the increase in greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, historically speaking. And so these are also considered the countries that need to pay for non-Annex 1 countries or developing countries to be able to support their development in a way that is not reliant on fossil fuels or on emitting greenhouse gases as well. So as that agreement needed to be reached, there's always this tension between those two parties to the convention in terms of Annex 1 countries request more ambition from developing countries, and developing countries request more financing. So, you know, it's a situation where it's a standoff, it's a Mexican standoff. And so in Copenhagen, Annex 1 countries pledged that they would be financing climate change up to the level of 100 billion a year. And against that, the agreement was signed, and this is where the whole process of the NDCs was initially started. So where do we stand with that now is a very good question, because it was never clarified what this 100 billion in financing would be made up of, whether it would be typical development assistance financing, whether it would be results-based financing, whether it would also include investments by the private sector, or if it would be market mechanisms as well. So the accounting for it is very difficult, and what has been happening, and there is no mechanism to track, so we don't really know where we stand on that. And again, there is a standoff on it where developing countries say that developed countries have not met their commitment to that 100 billion per year, and developed countries say, yes, we have. And this is where, you know, creative accounting finds its way.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. Anything else you would like to share with us before you go? You know, just why is this conference important at this time and to be held in Suriname? What's the significance of that?
Well, I think it's high time for countries that have this the same characteristics as Suriname, so a high forest cover and a low deforestation rate, to come together and to think, what is it that we're going to offer, and what is it that we're going to do, and how are we going to negotiate in the future? The Paris Agreement enters into force in 2020. There are a whole number of nationally determined contributions that have already been submitted to the UNFCCC. From 2008 until now, when the REDD mechanism was put in place, was agreed upon, we've seen very little financing for REDD, and in particular, very little financing for the investment phase, which is the most critical phase, because this is how you deliver the emission reductions that you generate. So as we've taken stock in 2018 of where REDD has gone and how far it's gone, we realize that it hasn't gone too far, but it has achieved certain things. It has put forests back on the map. It has put forest countries back on the map. It has highlighted this intersectoral dimension of reducing deforestation. And I think now maybe is the time to take it a step further and to think about, okay, what do we do with countries that don't have high rates of deforestation? Is there no merit in that? Do we consider that, does the international community essentially consider that countries with a low deforestation rate have a low deforestation rate by default because there are no people, no demand on land, no pressure on land? Does it mean it does not merit any support for maintaining it this way, or for supporting a development that is compatible with the high amount of forest cover that is needed there? And I think that, Suriname has not necessarily been a high-profile player in this area, And sometimes it takes the underdog to be able to shake things out, right? And so, in that sense, I think it's really important for Suriname to have hosted. So the conference and this thinking was necessary, and Suriname maybe was much better poised than other countries to do so. And so, hopes are high. There will be the declaration discussed in the coming 2 days as well. And then adopted by acclamation during the high-level day. I'm really hoping that this declaration will be different from others in a sense that it will not be. It's very difficult when you have declarations by consensus. Usually, it's the lowest common denominator that is adopted, right? It's generalities, and oftentimes it's also very diplomatic language. I'm really hoping that this time around we will, really highlight some of the key bottlenecks, some of the key issues and expectations by HFLD countries, some solutions as well, because we've heard some solutions proposed, and that after its adoption and this conference, the declaration will be carried forward by Suriname in the different climate fora that will be happening during this year, so that it holds the flag of HFLD countries for us.
Mirey Atallah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.